Good morning. It's Thursday, Coffee with Clarke, and we are in the section of Philippians where the subtitle is Christ is Preached. We're going to look at verses 12 through 18. But I want you to know, brethren, this is Paul again, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. And so we think of what Paul taught us in Romans chapter 8, that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So whenever we go through adversity, or why is this going on, or why did this happen, we have to step back and understand. We can't see it maybe at the time, but in time, as God works in the situation through our lives, we begin to see that if we're really trusting God, that whatever's going on will actually be used as a testimony to get our faith and what Christ has done for us regarding the gospel to other people. And this is what he's discussing here. He says, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard, all the people that were guarding Paul in prison to prevent him from escaping or whatever, and to all the rest, that my chains are in Christ. He was dealing with these problems because of his commitment to Jesus Christ. And so the chains were because of his faith in Christ, not anything he did wrong or bad or whatever. It was persecution, and that's what happens to us as Christians at times. We're accused for things that we didn't do wrong, but because of who we believe in and who we follow, we're culpable by ungodly forces. So he says he's become confident by my chains. They're much more bold to speak the word without fear. So people who watched Paul and how he maneuvered adversity and how he overcame fears and hatred and whatever it might be that would be typical in someone who's going through hard times that don't really appreciate them, that he's able, because of the Lord in his life, to see other people's lives being changed and the boldness for people to speak without fearing the consequences. And that's what happens in revival. In the book of the Acts, there was much persecution, but there was much growth in the church, as there is in China today. The more pressure that's put on Christians, the more bold they are to preach the gospel, and others are getting saved. Some indeed preach Christ in verse 15, even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. So he talked about others who were preaching at the time that had perhaps impure motives, but he wasn't making a big deal of them preaching. He said, the former preached Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains. So there was this competitive nature of fallen people who were sort of counterfeiting the gospel or taking advantage of the gospel to influence people, not for the glory of God or for their own soul, but for their own income or whatever it was they were pursuing. And they were supposing to add affliction to his chains. In other words, make it tougher for Paul, because he was sort of the ringleader, the one who started the gospel in these regions, and he was to blame for a lot of the things that were happening in the city with many people coming to Christ. But he said, some preach, but the latter out of love, knowing that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel. So Paul knew that the circumstances and the consequences of his life and the suffering was because he was called to preach the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice, and yes, I will rejoice. So Paul was the kind of guy that wasn't really spending a lot of time criticizing other pastors or other churches. He was only concerned that the gospel was preached. Didn't matter what the motivation was of the preacher or the church. The gospel is the gospel, and when it's clearly proclaimed, people get saved through the simple teaching of the gospel. So God bless you guys. We'll see you tomorrow.